So what is literary theory? Literary theory is a prompt. It's a provocation to think more intensely about literature, about what is, how it works, and what effect it can have on you, on me. Literary theory provides an analytical framework through which we can discover, within a literary text, the dynamics that animate individual subjects or specific cultures. It is a mode of reading. Now, there are many theories, often conflicting, that make up the thing called literary theory. To gain some familiarity with them, most fundamentally to appreciate the range of complexities that works of literature disclose and amplify. When you sit down to think about a Shakespearean play, is it the historical moment that impresses you? Is it the investigation into a trans-historical human emotion, an inquiry into gender relations? Or is it the philosophical examination, a self-reflexive meditation? So insofar as theory is a way of looking at things, you are a theorist, whether you know it or not. Learning something about literary theory then also means learning something about your own habits of mind and being able to describe those habits more precisely. So too, it means having those habits disrupted, finding yourself productively dislodged from one reading to another. Now, literary theory has also become a recognized body of thought that stretches from the ancient to the contemporary worlds. It became a particularly energetic and contested body of thought in the last decades of the 20th century. It challenged many institutional and institutionalized routines of appreciating and understanding great works of literature. It thwarted an aspiration shared by linguists and cybernetics to gain full command of apprehending the production of meaning and the process of communication. The so-called culture wars of the 1980s changed the literary canon and expanded the notion of literature itself. Those conflicts were funded in part by theory's revolution against unnoticed conformities and complacencies. It is this desire that helps to explain how literary theory morphs into a body of thought, cultural theory, or simply theory, that sets its sight both within and beyond literature. So on one hand, you have the Russian formalists of the first decade of the 20th century, which developed focused accounts of the way narratives are constructed, to a German emphasis on the experience of literature led to reader response criticism. Poetics continues the inquiry into questions about style and figurative language. And then you have feminist theory, queer theory, post-colonial theory, for instance, that focus expands beyond the text to the social fabric. Unsurprisingly then, literary theory has had an impact on many fields. Anthropology, historical, political science, legal studies. The impact derives not least from the theory's concerns with difference, both the difference between classes, genders, cultures, and the difference within. So the difference within a single psyche, a single statement, or even a single word. Of course, there are readers of literature who have happily ignored theory, as have more than a few literary critics. Indeed, there have been critics who write against theory, and others who declare the end of theory or the death of theory. It turns out, though, that literary theory does not die so easily. That is because it has been internalized. Theory has left a lasting impact on the way that literature is taught, providing an expanded toolkit for taking texts apart, putting them back together again. Theory may provide you with answers to questions you've already had. Now, they are questions that enable you to think differently about literature and language, society and culture, the world we live in, the world as it is, and the world as it might yet be.
If you're an astronomer, I say, you could spend your life asking the question, is there a life on other planets? If you're an engineer, you can spend your life asking, what's the best way to build this? And if you're an English major, you can spend the rest of your life asking, you want fries with that? But seriously, what kinds of questions do we ask when we study literature? Notice I said study, not just read. Literary theory doesn't have a whole lot of literature in it. Lit theory talks about how we think about literature, not just how we read it. Or as one student put it, I used to love literature, and then you made me think about it. So be warned. Like science, the study of literature has two components: an object of study, what you look at, and a methodology, how you look at the object. We have at least an intuitive idea of what our object of study is. It's literature, it's literary text. But how do we look at that object? What's our mode of investigation? What's our methodology? What kinds of questions are we asking? The two most asked literary questions are, what does this mean? What does this really mean? What is the deeper meaning, the hidden meaning, the symbolic meaning? Are all meanings present in the text? Did the author intend all these meanings? Are all meanings equally valid? And what does this do? Why is literature important? What effect does literature have on the reader? How does literature reflect history, culture, and diversity? How can literature be a force for social change? What would the world lose if we didn't have literature? We will start at the beginning.
So, if you are overwhelmed by the opening of this whole dialogue on literary theory, well, you probably should be. The topic of literary study is vast as the entirety of human knowledge. We are desperate to record everything, question everything, and force our world into an understanding despite the insurmountable. We are odd that way. Now, if you're a little bit sleepy or confused, and think, why the hell do I care what the words of some dusty old white guy from thousands of years ago and what his writings mean? Well, that's fair. But as Maria alluded to in her opening, it is for the lenses that we study literature. It allows us to experience various facets of life, the ability to unlock and make sense of the world around us, the reasons for our very existence. Literature is something that all humans have a stake in. We are societal creatures by nature, and literature is a representation of our recorded communication, discourses, ideas, and dreams. Therefore, the study of it, at least in some aspect, is an homage to our heritage and an attempt to build upon these ideas for our future. So, the beginning. Now, that's a bit of a hazy concept because the beginning of time and the end of time are widely debated. However, we're pretty solid in regards to about the past 5,000 years or so, and we can begin our survey of literature and literary study at that time period. Well, at least at the point when ideas about things start to be written down. So for basic necessities, we have 3: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, for, well, most Western philosophy anyway. So of the 3, we can discount Socrates. His existence is debated. We'll start with Plato. Plato, often credited with the beginnings of Western philosophy. His writings have led to him being considered a very accomplished literary figure. Plato's Republic contains very dramatic renderings of what exactly is considered to be good in this world. What exactly is worthy of human pursuits? It raises questions such as what is just, what is true, and these are of chief importance to him and his writings. He arrives at several conclusions that help to jumpstart humanity towards an intellectual understanding of the world. Plato values ideas and forms above all others, believing that these are manifestations of the mind that are rendered into this world by the hand of man, thereby giving more truth to the forms that exist in the mind. As it pertains to literature, though, Plato values intellectual discourse above all others, but sees very little use in the world of poetics and art. In fact, he'd go so far as to discount these professions entirely, believing that these works are mimetic or imitations of imitations, making them twice removed from reality. Despite his disdain for the artistic, Plato's publications raises questions about where it is exactly that humans pull their knowledge from, and deeper understandings. Do we get them from the ether, from God, from gods, or just in fact the good? Well, as is the case with any ideas that are made public, the moment that they are widely accepted or become what is considered fact, someone will invariably come along and try to disprove them, without fail. So in Plato's case, the most vocal disagreement to his ideas came from his own student, Aristotle. Now, the disconnect between these two seemed to stem from Plato's doctrine of forms. Rather than just an imitation, Aristotle viewed literature as more of a natural catalyst for change. Aristotle is famous for his writings on poetics, and in this text we see Aristotle challenge the precepts that were laid forth by his teacher, especially in regards to the place that an artist has in the world. He believed that rather than an imitator, art made its own accord and sought to improve upon nature. Regardless of who was right and who was wrong, this debate and others continue to develop and evolve between scholars as we move from classical to medieval to colonial to industrial periods. Time marches ever onward. We pass through various stages of human existence, from the intellectual loss of the Dark Ages, where, intellectual thought was held by nobles, the royalty, and the church, to the revelatory Renaissance, which had an awakening of the human spirit. The very nature of literary criticism and literary study has moved beyond the revelations of the classicals, Plato, Aristotle, but it has not forgotten the impact of these founders. Now, taking a major jump, largely for temporal purposes, it takes our discussion from the classical to the romantic. The 1700s sees thinkers moving from the existential as being vast unknowing and turning their focus inwards, a more nuanced examination of humanity. One such thinker is Immanuel Kant, a notoriously complex writer who's tried to solidify ideas and notions of humans into something that we could never, were able to verbalize. He tried to put it into writing. His critique on pure reason, practical reason, and judgment focus heavily on cognitive faculties and the power of the human mind. He relies on a priori knowledge that exists within all of us and allows us to have a deduction or a deductive handle on the universal concepts that influence the world. Essentially, the human mind dictates the world around us, and unlike Plato and previous thinkers, we're not limited to a vast unknown repositories of information such as the good. Rather, we are the repositories, and we shape the world. Literature helps us to unlock these different notions. This study of Kant helps us to understand how our human reason can influence and change the world. The last stop for the beginnings of literary criticism. Before we move into the modern world, we will end with the famous Karl Marx. Karl Marx began his philosophical inquiries in a group known as the Young Hegelians. Now, this group, and Marx particularly, were influenced by the work of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, in particular, the notions of the sublime and the human spirit. Sublime is an understanding that there are portions of this world that invoke such feelings of awe and unknowing that the human spirit gape in fear and wonder. To Marx, this notion manifested itself in that of the human spirit, in particular, its ability to overcome oppression, strictures, to always strive for freedom. So as a result, Marx's literature builds and awakens new ideas in people striving for freedom, not just the privileged, not just those with immense social status. Now, where Kant was concerned with the nature of understanding and its ability to construct the world, Marx wanted to question the very structures that human cognition was creating. The most famous of his works, as a social revolutionary, was the publication of the Communist Manifesto. Marx and his contemporaries used this literature and literary study to cite need for change and examine the inequities in the current systems that govern humanity. Marx saw that humanity had constructed social beliefs, and they were determining the consciousness of people, rendering them with struggles and class strife. Now, this was a very brief understanding of the beginnings of literary criticism. It's dramatic, it's varied, it's vast, and perhaps as time marches inexorably onward, we're going to see more and more schools of thought moving to this foundational category, the beginning. But for now, we can see that criticism of literature allows us to question the world, society, and ourselves. Literature is so deeply ingrained in humanity that it is inextricably intertwined with our identities, from our senses of ourselves to our very own linguistic development.
Ferdinand de Saussure was a Swiss linguist and was regarded as a founder of structuralist linguistics. Saussure's course in general linguistics has had a very substantial influence on literary and cultural studies, particularly in the fields of structuralism. As he establishes his theories, Saussure utilizes binary concepts such as synchronic, diachronic, langue, parole, signifier, signified, and syntagmatic associate relations. Linguistics is one of the many disciplines that have contributed to the growth of modern literary theory, not only because of the major development in literary practice, but also because of those of the study of language. Literary study has moved from the position that viewed literature as a predominantly natural phenomenon to a more questioning approach which now interrogates many aspects which were previously considered unquestionable, self-evident, or natural. Linguists until the 19th century were mainly interested in the ways which language changed across the age. Historical linguists studied the origin of individual words and tried to formulate the laws that apparently govern processes of linguistic change. However, in early 20th century, those ways were rethought, and the work of Saussure in particular is fundamental to the growth of the movement that has become known as structuralism. Due to the influence of Saussure, literature was analyzed scientifically and schematic way to discover underlying structure of literature, which was fundamental view of structuralism. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian physician and the founder of psychoanalysis, a clinical method for treating psychopathology through dialogue between the patient and the psychoanalyst. Freudian theories can be identified by three basic principles. The first one is psychic determinism, the principles that all mental events, including dreams, fantasies, errors, and neurotic symptoms, have meaning. It leads to the psychoanalytic literary criticism. The object can be the psychoanalysis of the author or of a particularly interesting character in a given work. Critics may view the fictional characters as psychological case studies, attempting to identify Freudian concepts and demonstrate how they influence the thoughts and behaviors of fictional characters. The second principle is primacy of the unconscious mind in mental life, the unconscious being regarded as a dynamic force drawing on the energy of instinctual drives and as a location of desires which were repressed because they are socially unacceptable or a threat to the ego. The last one is developmental view of human life, which stresses the importance of infantile experience and accounts for personality in terms of the progressive channeling of an undifferentiated energy or libido. Freudian theories have influence on literature criticism, both theory and practice, much more than creative literature. That is, Freud has helped us more to understand and appreciate and exist in the poems, novels, and plays than to write new ones. There is no practicing literary critic today without good knowledge of Freud and post-Freudian thinkers such as Lacan. After structuralism, literary criticism has become more and more interdisciplinary. Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who has been called the most controversial psychoanalyst since Freud. He is sometimes considered the French Freud, revitalized psychoanalysis, one of the great thinkers in the 20th century. He developed the mirror stage, initial self-recognition. It can begin as early as 6 months of age. It was initially developed in the 1930s. In this stage, the ego is an object rather than subject. It is like I as another. Adrian Johnson mentions Lacan views the ego as thoroughly compromised and inherently neurotic to its very core, as a passionate defense of the constitutive ignorance of the unconscious. Influenced by Lacan, there came up the new way of criticizing, which distinguished the narrator of the text and actual author, since the author was criticized as untidy. Herman Northrop Frye was a Canadian educator and literary critic. He is one of the most important literary theorists in the 20th century. He challenged the hegemony of the new criticism by emphasizing the modes and genes of literature text. Rather than analyze the language of individual works of literature, as the new critics did, Frye stressed the larger or deeper imaginative patterns from which all literary works are constructed and the recurring importance of literature underlying archetypes. He studied T.S. Eliot, John Milton's epics, Shakespearean comedy and tragedy, and so on. Frye's primary contribution was to shape the discipline of criticism, asking what if criticism is a science as well as an art. Frye launched a pursuit, which is to occupy the rest of his career, establishing criticism as a coherent field of study which trains the imagination quite as systematically and efficiently as a science trained the reason. Jacques Derrida is a French philosopher who is known for his contribution to the philosophical notion of deconstruction, a way of criticizing not only because literary and philosophical texts, but also political institutions. He sought to examine the relationship between meaning and the text. Deconstruction is a philosophical method asserting that meanings, metaphysical constructs, and hierarchical oppositions are unstable due to their dependence on ultimately arbitrary signifier. It is a double movement of simultaneous affirmation and undoing, said Nancy Holland. Because of its essence, it's impossible to define deconstruction, and it's always on text. It questions us normality in life, and it affects the way of evaluating literature. Derrida published 40 texts in philosophy and literature. One of the most influential work is of grammatology. He examines the relation between speech and writing and investigates how speech and writing develop as forms of language. Writing has often been considered to be derived from speech, and this attitude has been reflected for a long time. He also discusses Saussure and his programmatic approach to written language. Saussure articulates that language and writing are two distinct systems of signs. The second exists for the sole purpose of representing the first. Derrida claims that the tendency to regard writing as an expression of speech leads to that misunderstanding that speech is closer than writing to the truth of the meaning and representation. Derrida argues that writing is a system that is a legitimate form on its own, even though of grammatology is a comparatively early work. It offers a classic statement of deconstructive processes. Also, deconstruction leads us new approach towards the way of analyzing literature.
Virginia Woolf was one of the central figures of the movement of feminist criticism, which causes a huge social influence. Basically, there are three waves of the feminist movement. Each wave dealt with different aspects of the same feminist issues. The first wave comprised the women's suffrage movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, promoting women's right to vote. The second wave was associated with the ideas and actions of the women's liberation movement. It campaigned for legal and social equality for women. The third wave is a continuation of the perceived failures of second wave feminism, which began in the 1990s. In her book, A Room of One's Own, Woolf exposed the women's adverse environment, explaining how it impeded women's writing. Only Jane Austen and Emily Bronte received Woolf's accolades by virtue of their refusing to adopt the prevailing masculine convictions. For example, that football and sport are important, the worship of fashion, the buying of clothes trivial. What genius, what integrity it must have required in face of all that criticism, in the midst of that purely patriarchal society, to hold fast to the thing as they saw it without shrinking. In Woolf's judgment, the brilliance of Austen and Bronte is due precisely to the fact that they wrote as women write, not as men write. Also, Woolf laid much strength on Mourning and A Room of One's Own because intellectual freedom depends upon material things. Poetry depends upon intellectual freedom. Woolf criticized patriarchal society pungently and tried to raise women's awareness of being materially independent. Her idea is still refreshing and applicable nowadays. Females enjoy more and more equal rights as men. Women's defense and pursuit for their rights is always on the way once the patriarchal society comes back. Woolf also announces boldly her affinity for the members of her sex. The truth is, I often like women. I like their unconventionality. I like their subtlety. I like their anonymity. But I must not run on in this way. Bloomsbury is regarded as queer subculture. As a member of Bloomsbury, Woolf's homosexual tendency also contributes to queer culture. She liberated sex from the traditional canon and brought the diversity of the love. In many of her works, queer culture is brought up. Because of that, queer culture becomes popular. In many countries, the homosexual marriage becomes legal. Nowadays, the world becomes more open to homosexual groups and tries to keep the diversity of love. As the development of the social media, there appears the fourth wave feminism. Fourth wave feminism refers to a resurgence of interest in feminism that began around 2012 and is associated with the use of social media. According to feminist scholar Prudence, the focus of the fourth wave is justice for women and opposition to sexual harassment and violence against women. Fourth wave feminism is defined by technology, according to Carroll, and is characterized particularly by the use of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and blogs, and etc. As the prevalence of Hollywood cinema film study rises, feminist cinema, advocating or illustrating feminist perspectives, arise largely with the development of feminist film theory in the late 16th and early 17th and pushes feminism further. Laura Mulvey incorporates the Freudian idea of phallocentrism into visual pleasure and narrative cinema. Using Freud's thoughts, Mulvey insists on the idea that images, characters, plots, and stories and dialogues in films are inadvertently built on the ideas of the patriarchies, both within and beyond sexual contents. Mulvey suggests two distinct modes of the male gaze of this era, voyeuristic and fetishistic. Mulvey argues that the only way to annihilate the patriarchal Hollywood system is to radically challenge and reshape the filmic strategies of classic Hollywood with alternative feminist methods. She calls for a new feminist avant-garde filmmaking that would rapture the narrative pleasure of classical Hollywood filmmaking. Both Woolf and Mulvey made efforts to collapse the hierarchy in the pair male and female, which echoed Derrida's idea of deconstruction. Because of the introduction of deconstruction, many Western values have been re-evaluated. Likewise, Chinese philosophy is also closely related to the social life. In Chinese philosophy, we have three teachings. The phrase three teachings refers to Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism when considered as a harmonious aggregate. Confucianism is a complex school of thought, sometimes also referred to as a religion, revolving around the principles of the Chinese philosophy, Kongqiu. Main concepts of this philosophy include Ru, means humanness, righteousness, propriety, loyalty, and filial piety, along with a strict adherence to social rules. This is illustrated through the five main relationships Confucius interpreted to be the core of society, that is, ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, friend and friend. In these bonds, the latter must pay respect to and serve the former, while the former is bound to care for the latter. The following quotation is from the Analects, a compilation of Confucius' sayings and teachings, written after his death by his disciples. The superior man has a dignified ease without pride. The mean man has pride without a dignified ease. This quotation exemplifies Confucius' ideas of the Junzi, means gentleman. Originally, this expression referred to the son of a ruler, but Confucius redefined this concept to mean behavior instead of mere social status. Taoism or Taoism is a philosophy centered on the belief that life is normally happy but should be lived with balance and virtue. Its origin can be tracked back to the late 4th century BC, and the main thinkers representative of this teaching are Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. Key components of Taoism are Tao and immortality, along with a strength on balance found throughout nature. There is less emphasis on extremes and instead focus on the interdependence between things. For example, the yin-yang symbol does not exemplify good or evil. It shows that there are two sides to everything. Within the yang, there exists the yin and vice versa. The basis of Taoist philosophy is the idea of Wu Wei, means doing, not doing, but in practice, it refers to an in-between state of not doing and being, but not acting. This concept also overlaps with an idea in Confucianism, as Confucius similarly believed that a perfect sage could rule without taking action. Two other assumptions in the Taoist system are: the first one is any extreme action can initiate a counteraction of equal extremity, and the second one is excessive government can become tyrannical and unjust, even government created with good intentions. The following is a quote from the Tao Te Ching, one of the main texts in Taoist teachings. The truth is not always beautiful, nor beautiful was the truth. The main principles of Buddhism are reincarnation and impermanence. Buddhists believe that life is full of suffering, but that suffering can be overcome by attaining enlightenment. nirvana can be obtained by breaking away from material attachments and purifying the mind. However, different doctrines vary on the practice and path followed in order to do so. Meditation serves as a significant part in practicing Buddhism. This calming and working of the mind helps Buddhists strive to become more peaceful and positive, while developing wisdom through solving everyday problems. Most of us Chinese people grow up under the influence of these three teachings. Many social norms and moral judgments are shaped based on these three teachings.
Critical disability studies emerged from both feminist criticism and queer theory, and formally began in 1986 when the Section for the Study of Chronic Illness, Impairment, and Disability of Social Science Association was renamed the Society for Disability Studies. Its journal, Disability Studies Quarterly, was the first journal in disability studies. The first U.S. disability studies program emerged in 1994 at Syracuse University. Many scholars believe that the rise of disability studies is also due to the 1990 passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. According to Alan Brizzi, disability studies considers disability in political, aesthetic, ethical, and cultural contexts, among others. In literature, many critics examine works to understand how representations of disability and normal bodies change throughout history, including the ways both are defined within the limits of historical or cultural situations. Disability studies also investigates images and descriptions of disability, prejudice against people with disabilities or ableism, and the ways narrative relates to disability. It's important to understand disability as part of one's identity, much like race, class, gender, sexuality, and nationality. Because of its concern with the body and embodiment, disability studies also intersects other critical schools like gender studies, queer studies, feminism, critical race studies, and more. In fact, many races, classes, ethnicities, and other parts of identity have been classified as or associated with disabilities in the past, emphasizing what feminist and disability theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson describes as the tendency of disability to be a synecdoche for all forms that culture deems non-normative. Put differently, disability frequently signifies things outside of the normal world, making it an important area to investigate critically. Traditionally, disability studies is divided into two main branches, that of the medical model and the social model. The medical model locates the issue of disability within the individual and tries to correct or fix the individual instead of attempting to accommodate them within society. For example, a student who is nearsighted and attempting to read a chalkboard within a classroom should use glasses to see instead of moving towards the board in order to read it, according to the medical model. Through this example, we can see that those who use the medical model attempt to change the individual instead of fixing the situation that causes the disability. Brizzi states that the social model of disability is a theory that distinguishes between impairment and disability. Impairment refers to a physical limitation, while disability refers to social exclusion. For instance, damage to the optic nerve resulting in limited vision may be an impairment. However, the inaccessibility of our society to those who are partially or fully blind is really based on assumptions about what a normal body is, not on some universal truth or ideal. The social model stresses that we are living in a disabled society, that the issue isn't people with disabilities, rather society has failed to account for the diversity of bodies that live in the world. Sociologist Tom Shakespeare writes that the social model is useful for creating a group identity, spreading knowledge about disability, and promoting activism. However, the social model has been criticized in recent decades for too easily making distinctions between physical impairment and social disability. The way we understand the body is based on socially constructed terms, ideas, and narratives. Therefore, the body is always already socially coded in one way or another. So the clear dividing line between the medical model and social sometimes breaks down. Nevertheless, the social model is a good starting point for many when thinking about disability. Brizzi writes that many literary critics in disability studies examine the ways novels and other public spaces reinforce concepts about normal individuals. For instance, Leonard Davis writes about the historical context of the term normal, noting that the word's modern use came into being with the rise of statistics and eugenics in the 19th century. At this time, the idea of the average man became central to national discourses. For Davis, a normal body is actually a theory or idea based on the average man, a concept that ultimately disguises the drastic differences among individuals in a society. In the context of literature, Davis writes, the very structures on which the novel rests tend to be normative, ideologically emphasizing the universal quality of the central character whose normativity encourages us to identify with him or her. Therefore, investigating normalcy in the literary text allows one to use a disability studies approach when reading almost any work. Rosemary Garland Thompson uses the term normate to describe those who are unmarked by the stigmas of disability, framing disability as a minority rather than medical discourse. The word normate highlights assumptions about the body in politics, rhetoric, literature, and other areas, including the erasure of cultural and bodily difference.